Blood dripped down Thyra's arm as she held the dagger against the stranger lying in her bed. The blade trembled in her hand, reflecting the pale moonlight filtering through the cracks of the cabin. The man breathed deeply, unaware of the danger looming over him. Thyra knew she had to kill him before he uncovered her secret, the greatest secret a Viking widow could ever hide. Thank you for being here and watching. This channel is just beginning its journey, and every subscription means the world, helping us reach our first 1,000 followers and keep these stories alive. If you enjoy what you see, please consider subscribing and sharing where you're watching from in the comments. Your support brings these ancient tales back to life. The bitter cold clawed through the thin wooden walls of the small cabin, settling deep into the bones of the land it perched upon. Inside, the air was thick with the faint scent of smoke from the dying fire in the hearth, mingling with the earthy aroma of worn animal pelts. Outside, the endless winter stretched its icy fingers across the fjord, blanketing every branch, every rock, every path in a suffocating shroud of snow. The wind howled like a restless spirit, rattling the fragile walls with relentless fury. It was in this harsh, unforgiving landscape that Thyra Halldórsdóttir awoke, as she had every morning for nearly 2 years. The pale light of dawn struggled through the cracks in the wooden planks, casting long, uneven shadows across the earthen floor. Her breath came in white plumes, a visible reminder of the cold that settled in the corners of the cabin and refused to be banished. The world outside was silent, save for the distant groan of ice shifting beneath the weight of the winter. At 27, Thyra was no stranger to hardship. Her face, framed by long, dark blonde braids, held a quiet strength, a balance between softness and unyielding resolve. Her green-gray eyes, deep and watchful, flicked open with the faintest hint of weariness, but also a spark of determination that refused to be dimmed. Her skin was pale, almost translucent against the low light, dotted with faint freckles that stretched across the bridge of her nose like the faint map of a secret territory. Beside her, the rough woolen blanket lay tangled where she had slept, now soaked with the lingering chill of the night. She shifted carefully, careful not to disturb the small bundle nestled beneath the layers of furs, a life hidden away from prying eyes. Her gaze lingered for a moment on the child's delicate features before she pushed herself silently from the bed. The cabin's modest furnishings spoke of a life measured by necessity rather than luxury. Thick pelts lined the floor, their coarse texture a buffer against the unforgiving cold beneath. A sturdy wooden table bore the scars of countless meals and whispered stories in its worn grooves. Nearby, a small wooden chest sat partly concealed beneath the bed frame, its carved surface etched with simple runes that flickered faintly in the firelight, a silent guardian of secrets best kept hidden. Thyra moved with practiced ease, the rhythm of her morning routine as familiar as the biting winter winds. Her hands, calloused from endless labor and the weight of survival, stoked the embers of the fire until warm flames roared to life once more. The flickering light cast dancing shadows against the rough walls, bringing a brief warmth to the cold, austere room. The sound of wood crackling and the soft hiss of thawing snow outside momentarily drew her attention. She paused, listening intently, muscles taut and senses sharpened. The settlement beyond was silent, buried beneath layers of frost. Few dared to venture out in such conditions, and those who did moved with furtive steps, heads bowed against the wind. Her gaze settled on the small wooden box beneath the bed. Thyra's fingers brushed the surface, tracing the runes with a tenderness belying the harshness of her existence. Within lay the greatest secret she bore, the hidden life beneath her roof, a fragile hope wrapped in cloth and silence. No one in the settlement knew. No one could know, for the price of discovery would be unthinkable. Outside, the sky was a muted canvas of grays and whites, the sun a pale disk struggling to break through the endless clouds. The air was sharp and penetrating, each breath a sting in the lungs, a reminder of the relentless winter that defined this place and time. The snow underfoot was deep and treacherous, muffling all sound but the crunch of careful steps. Dressed in layers of wool and leather, Thyra prepared herself for the day ahead. Her tunic, dyed a deep blue, hugged her slender frame beneath a worn brown overdress. A thick leather belt fastened tight at her waist held a small dagger, a weapon as much for protection as for ritual. Her boots, lined with rabbit fur, were worn but sturdy, each stitch a testament to careful craftsmanship born of necessity. She pulled her cloak tighter around her shoulders, the heavy hood shielding her face from the cold gusts that swept in when she opened the door. The world outside beckoned, bleak and merciless, but it was all she had. The settlement was small, clustered near the jagged coastline, where the frozen sea met rugged cliffs. Simple wooden houses, their thatched roofs weighed down by snow, huddled together as if for warmth and safety. Wisps of smoke curled from chimneys, carrying the faint scent of burning pine and fish oil. The horizon was a blur, as if the sky and earth had merged into one endless expanse of white. Thyra stepped outside, the crunch of snow underfoot breaking the morning silence. The air was sharp, biting at exposed skin, and her breath billowed in clouds that vanished quickly into the cold. She moved with purpose, but not haste, each step deliberate in the deep snow. Her eyes scanned the few figures visible in the distance, women wrapped in thick woolen shawls, bent over their weaving looms, or tending small fires where root vegetables simmered. The men, fewer still, were clustered near the communal hall, discussing the day's plans in hushed tones. Life here was a constant battle against the elements and the ever-present threat of hunger. She made her way toward the hall, a sturdy timber structure adorned with carved dragon heads that seemed to watch over the gathering. Inside, the air was warmer but heavy with the mingled scents of damp wool, sweat, and smoke. The low murmur of voices filled the space, punctuated by the rhythmic clatter of weaving and the occasional soft laughter. Thyra's presence drew a few glances, some curious, others wary. As a widow without children, her place in the social order was fragile. The protection afforded by the late Ragnar's name was fading, replaced by whispers and suspicion. Her survival depended on the delicate balance between visibility and invisibility, between offering enough to the community to be tolerated and keeping her true strength hidden. Helga, the Jarl's wife, was among the women gathered near the fire. Her dark eyes flicked toward Thyra with an expression that was equal parts caution and calculation. The elaborate braids in Helga's hair, threaded with silver beads, caught the light as she turned to speak. "Thyra," Helga said smoothly, her voice carrying the subtle edge of authority, "I heard you had company last night." Thyra's heart tightened, but her face betrayed nothing. "A trader passed through, seeking shelter from the storm. I offered what hospitality I could," she replied evenly, her voice steady despite the knot tightening in her chest. A faint smile curved Helga's lips, but her eyes remained cold. "Hospitality is a valued tradition," she said, "yet it is curious how often you welcome strangers when few come here in such harsh weather." The women nearby exchanged knowing glances, their whispers barely subduing the undercurrent of judgment. Thyra felt the weight of their scrutiny, a silent accusation that pierced deeper than any blade. But survival in these lands demanded hard choices. Since Ragnar's death nearly 2 winters ago, Thyra had carved out a precarious existence through whispered alliances and unspoken arrangements. Offering shelter to passing men, travelers, merchants, sometimes wandering warriors, was a currency she could trade. In exchange, she received provisions, information, and a measure of protection. It was an unspoken pact that the settlement tolerated so long as discretion was maintained. Yet the price was always high. Each guest brought with them the threat of exposure, the risk that her secret, the child hidden beneath the bed, would be discovered. The mere thought tightened Thyra's chest with fear and resolve. She nodded slightly in acknowledgment of Helga's words, then turned away to tend to her tasks. The women resumed their weaving, their fingers deftly working the coarse threads, creating cloth that would shield their families from the relentless cold. As the day wore on, the sky remained leaden and heavy. The wind continued its ceaseless assault, rattling the timbers of the hall and carrying with it the scent of the sea, salt and ice, raw and unforgiving. Outside, the snow lay thick and undisturbed, except for the faint tracks of a solitary fox, a fleeting reminder of life enduring against all odds. Returning to her cabin with a basket of wool for spinning, Thyra's thoughts were heavy. The fragile balance she maintained teetered on the edge. Every shadow seemed to harbor threat, every glance held suspicion. Yet beneath the weight of fear, a deeper current ran, hope. Hope born not from the certainty of safety, but from the fierce determination to protect what was hers at any cost. As she approached the door, her sharp eyes caught sight of a figure standing at the edge of the settlement, a stranger. The man was tall and broad-shouldered, his fiery red hair dusted with snow, his gaze steady and penetrating. His cloak, lined with wolf pelts, billowed slightly in the wind, and the glint of a long sword at his side marked him as no mere traveler. Their eyes met across the distance, and an unexpected shiver ran through Thyra, not of cold, but something deeper, a flicker of recognition and unease. The man's expression was unreadable, but there was a weight in his gaze that unsettled her. As he spoke briefly with the guards, his eyes never left hers, as if searching, questioning, probing for a secret he already suspected. Time seemed to slow as the afternoon faded into twilight. The wind softened to a mournful sigh, and the sky darkened into shades of deep blue and gray. Within the settlement, the promise of night brought a hush over the land. Later, a firm knock echoed on Thyra's door. Heart-pounding, she opened it to find the stranger standing there, accompanied by Bjorn, the Jarl's trusted guard. Bjorn's grin was sharp, knowing, as if he relished the tension he sowed. "This is Thyra Haldor's daughter," Bjorn announced with a crooked smile. "Thyra, this is Sigurd Haraldason. He needs shelter tonight. The Jarl thinks your cabin is best suited given your experience with guests." Thyra regarded Sigurd carefully. His blue eyes, fierce and watchful, held a strange intensity. The weight of his presence filled the small doorway. There was no mistaking the fact he was a warrior, one who bore the marks of battle and the scars of hardship. Swallowing the tight knot of apprehension, she stepped aside. "You are welcome to warm yourself by the fire," she said, voice steady but cautious. As Sigurd entered, the cold air followed him in, a reminder of the outside world's harsh grip. Bjorn lingered a moment longer, flashing a sly wink before departing, leaving Thyra and Sigurd alone. The small cabin seemed to shrink beneath the weight of unspoken words.
Sigurd's gaze traveled the sparse furnishings, settling briefly on the fire before turning back to Thyra. "You make a fine home for a woman living alone," he said quietly, his voice low and steady. Thyra met his eyes without flinching. "I do what I must to survive." He smiled then, but it was a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "And what does survival look like for you, Thyra, Haldor's daughter?" The question hung in the air like a blade poised just out of sight. Thyra's pulse quickened, but her voice remained controlled. "Survival is doing what is necessary." Sigurd's gaze sharpened. "Necessary? Including sharing your bed with strangers in the dead of winter?" The words were pointed, but not cruel. Thyra's jaw tightened, her fingers curling into fists at her sides. "If the Jarl sent you here, surely he made the terms clear." A faint chuckle escaped Sigurd. "Yes, the Jarl's orders are persuasive. Yet I've heard the rumors, the widow who keeps her hearth warm with more than just fire." The room seemed to close in around her. The whispers from the hall, the wary glances, the veiled threats, they all converged into this moment. Thyra drew a slow breath, steadying herself. "What I offer is protection," she said, voice low but firm. "And hospitality, Viking law demands." Sigurd leaned back, his eyes gleaming with an unreadable emotion. "Hospitality can be many things." Thyra turned away, gathering the empty bowls from the small table. "Night falls. Rest by the fire, if you must, but my bed is mine alone." As the shadows deepened and the fire cracked low, the two shared the small, cold space, each guarding their own secrets, each sizing the other with silent calculation. Outside, the wind pressed against the cabin walls, as if eager to shatter the fragile peace within. Beneath the bed, hidden from the world, the secret waited. A secret wrapped in furs and silence, an innocent life that carried the weight of legacy and danger. The harsh winter night stretched on, a fragile barrier between past and future, between fear and hope. And in the flickering firelight, the fragile threads of trust began to weave themselves, tentative, uncertain, but powerful enough to change the course of their lives forever. Night deepened beyond the thin wooden walls of the cabin, the shadows dancing in the firelight like restless spirits. The wind pressed against the small structure, carrying the bitter cold of the relentless winter beyond the fjord. Inside, the room held a fragile stillness, broken only by the crackling of embers and the soft breathing of the two who shared the space. Thyra, seated near the fire, wrapped in layers of worn wool, watched Sigurd. His presence unsettled her, but more than that, it stirred something buried deep beneath her cautious exterior. Her gaze drifted involuntarily toward the low bed, beneath which lay the hidden bundle wrapped tightly in furs.
The child's gentle breaths were a quiet defiance against the cruel world outside, a secret that needed protection at any cost. Thyra's heart clenched again, the weight of what she guarded a heavy anchor on her soul. The stranger in her home carried the memory of Ragnar, the man she had loved and lost, and that memory both offered hope and threatened destruction. Sigurd's voice broke the silence, low and steady. "You carry many burdens, Thyra, more than most would survive." She met his eyes, seeing in them a flicker of understanding that surprised her. "Survival demands burdens," she said quietly, "and secrets." He nodded slowly, then hesitated before speaking again. "There is someone you should know about, someone who is in grave danger." A chill ran down her spine, though not from the cold. "Who?" she asked, voice barely a whisper. Sigurd's gaze darkened. "A child, a boy, alone and hunted. I have seen him, not far from here, near the edge of the forest." Thyra's breath caught. Her mind raced to the hidden child beneath the bed. Was this some cruel trick, or had fate drawn a thread she could not ignore? "Why have you come here?" she demanded, rising from her seat. The firelight flickered across her determined face, casting shadows that deepened the lines of weariness etched by years of hardship. "To find you, to warn you, to offer help," Sigurd replied, stepping closer. "The Jarl's men search the woods. They hunt for any sign of those who might challenge his rule. A child like yours would be a prize and a threat." Her heart pounded. The Jarl's reach was long, and his wrath merciless. Her fragile secrecy, held at bay by cold nights and whispered alliances, was now threatened by the harsh light of day. "I cannot abandon him," Thyra said fiercely. "He is my son, my blood." Sigurd's voice softened. "I do not ask you to abandon him, but to consider a path that might save both of you." Thyra's hands clenched at her sides, the weight of impossible choices pressing down on her. To flee meant risking everything: the safety of the only home she had left, the fragile trust of the settlement, and the hope of a future for her son. To stay meant hiding in the shadows, always running from fear. A sudden, faint noise from the corner of the room made them both freeze. The child stirred, a soft whimper breaking the silence. Thyra moved swiftly, gathering the boy into her arms, feeling the warmth of his small body against hers. "Eirik," she whispered, brushing back the fine hair from his face. His eyes opened, wide and searching, reflecting the flickering firelight. In that moment, the fierce love of a mother overwhelmed every doubt and fear. Sigurd knelt before them, his blue eyes steady and solemn. "I fought beside your husband," he said quietly. "He entrusted me with a promise, to keep you both safe. That promise is not broken." Thyra looked down at her son, then back to the stranger who carried the weight of her past and the uncertain hope of her future. Her resolve wavered, torn between instinct to protect and the possibility of salvation. "Tell me," she said, voice trembling with a mixture of hope and fear, "what path do you offer?" Sigurd's expression grew grave. "There is a ship hidden along the eastern shore, beyond the cliffs. If we leave before dawn, we can sail away from the Jarl's reach, into lands where the boy can grow without fear." A silence fell between them, thick with the enormity of the choice. Thyra's mind raced through memories: the bitter cold, the whispered suspicions of the settlement, the lonely nights spent guarding a secret that could destroy them all. But the child in her arms was the future, fragile yet fierce, and in his eyes she saw a light that no winter could snuff out. "I will trust you," she finally said, voice steady but barely above a whisper, "for his sake." Sigurd offered a small, grim smile. "Then we must prepare. The night will not wait." As the fire dwindled to glowing embers, Thyra moved with purpose, gathering what little they could carry. Layers of thick wool and fur, dried meats wrapped in cloth, a small wooden bowl for water. Each item chosen with care, a lifeline in the cold abyss. Eirik nestled against her chest, his warmth a balm against the biting chill. Thyra's thoughts wove between past and future. The love lost, the dangers yet to come, and the fragile hope that shone like a beacon through the darkness. Outside, the storm whispered against the cabin walls, as if warning of the trials ahead. But inside, a quiet determination settled like a shield, binding the unlikely trio together in a pact of survival and trust. The weight of the secret no longer pressed solely on Thyra's shoulders. It was shared now with the warrior who had come seeking a promise, and the child who carried the legacy of a fallen hero. And as the first faint light of dawn brushed the frozen horizon, the cabin doors creaked open to the cold world beyond, ready to face whatever fate awaited them on the road ahead. The cabin's door groaned softly as Thyra pushed it closed behind her, the outside world swallowed again by the relentless winter beyond. Inside, the dim light from the dying embers barely warmed the small room, but it was enough to cradle a fragile sense of refuge. The air was thick with the scent of smoke and cold wood, mingled with the faint, unmistakable warmth of life. Eric's breath, steady and soft against the chill. Thyra's hands trembled ever so slightly as she settled the child deeper into her arms, wrapping him tighter in the thick woolen mantle she had prepared for the journey. His small fingers curled instinctively around the coarse fabric, a silent plea for comfort in a world that had yet to offer him safety.
The boy's blue eyes, so like Ragnar's, flickered open briefly, meeting hers with a fragile trust that both shattered and steeled her heart. Sigurd stood near the hearth, the firelight casting flickering shadows across his battle-worn face. His blue eyes, sharp and watchful, softened just a fraction as he observed the exchange between mother and son. The weight of the moment settled between them, a shared understanding born of hardship, loss, and the unspoken promise that bound their fates. Without words, Sigurd moved to the worn wooden table, brushing aside a few scraps of cloth and empty bowls with the same care reserved for handling weapons before battle. He set down a small wooden bowl and began to stir the last remnants of a thin broth, its aroma faint but enough to stir hunger in the depths of the cold room. Thyra watched him, the tension in her shoulders easing just slightly. The presence of another, a man who had once stood beside her husband, was disquieting. Yet here he was, offering sustenance without demand, protection without question. "Drink," Sigurd said quietly, his voice rough but steady, handing the bowl toward her. She took it with a nod, carefully lifting Eric a little to sip the warm liquid into his mouth. The boy's lips parted slightly, taking in the life-giving broth, his small face relaxing in the glow of comfort. The simple act of feeding felt monumental, a quiet rebellion against the harshness that awaited beyond these walls. The room fell into a silence that was neither empty nor oppressive. It carried the weight of shared history and the tentative hope of a future forged in trust. Thyra's eyes met Sigurd's, and in that glance she saw the flicker of a man burdened by his own ghosts, ghosts that seemed to mirror her own. "Your son," Sigurd murmured, breaking the quiet. "He carries the strength of his father." Thyra's breath caught, and she drew Eric closer. Ragnar believed in something greater than these frozen lands. He believed in a future beyond the endless winter. Sigurd nodded, stepping closer, his voice lowering. "That is why I am here, to help you protect that future." Her gaze dropped to the small bundle in her arms, the secret she had guarded with every ounce of her being. The child who could never be seen, never be spoken of aloud. The child who was reason and rebellion in equal measure. As the fire crackled softly, casting its golden light on their faces, Sigurd reached into a pouch at his belt and produced a small cloth-wrapped bundle. He unfolded it carefully, revealing a piece of cloth embroidered with intricate runes, symbols of protection and guidance. "For Eric," he said simply, "a talisman Ragnar entrusted to me, to guard your son when you cannot." Thyra's fingers brushed the cloth reverently. The familiar runes seemed to pulse with a quiet power, a legacy of the gods inscribed in thread.
She looked up, meeting Sigurd's steady gaze, and for the first time the walls she had built around herself seemed to soften. "You carry his memory like a shield," she whispered, "but what of your own?" Sigurd's jaw tightened, and for a moment the warrior's mask slipped, revealing a vulnerability that matched her own. "I am cursed to carry the scars of many battles, some visible, others hidden deep within." Their eyes locked in a moment of unspoken understanding, a silent pact forged not by words but by the shared weight of loss and the fierce need to protect what remained. Outside, the wind howled, pressing against the cabin's fragile walls. Inside, the fire's warmth grew steady, a beacon against the encroaching cold. Eirik stirred again, his small hand reaching out, brushing against Sigurd's calloused fingers. A faint smile touched the warrior's lips, roughened by years of hardship. "He is stronger than any man I've known," Sigurd said softly, "stronger than the storms that rage beyond these walls." Thyra's heart thudded in her chest, a mixture of hope and fear swirling within. To trust was to expose herself, to risk everything. Yet to reject this fragile alliance was to face the winter alone. A brief silence fell between them before Thyra spoke, her voice steady as the fire's glow. "You spoke of lands beyond the Jarl's reach. Where is this place?" Sigurd's eyes flickered toward the shadows beyond the hearth. To the south, beyond the fjord, a small village hidden from the eyes of men like Gunnar. There Eirik can grow free. She considered his words, weighing the promise against the peril. The thought of fleeing the only home she had known was daunting, but the thought of losing her son was unbearable. "I will prepare," Thyra said quietly. "But until then," her gaze lingered on the flickering flames, "we survive this night." Sigurd nodded, his expression resolute. Together. The hours stretched on, marked by small, tender moments, the brush of fingers smoothing a tangled braid, the soft murmur of lullabies sung in low tones, the shared warmth of bodies pressed close against the biting cold. In these moments, Thyra felt the fragile threads of trust begin to weave themselves into something stronger, a shield against the darkness outside. She watched Sigurd carefully as he tended the fire, his movements deliberate and unhurried. The scars on his forearms caught the light, telling silent stories of battles fought and survived. His eyes, even in shadow, held a fierce determination that reminded her of Ragnar, but tempered by wisdom born of solitude. Eirik's breathing slowed, his tiny chest rising and falling in peaceful rhythm. Thyra's fingers traced the curve of his cheek, her heart aching with a love fierce enough to defy the winter's cruelty. Sigurd caught her gaze once more, his voice a low murmur in the quiet room. "You have been strong, Thyra, stronger than any would expect." She allowed herself a small, weary smile. "Strength is not always seen. Sometimes it is buried beneath fear and silence." A moment passed, heavy with the weight of unspoken truths. Then Sigurd spoke again, softer this time. "In time, you will not need to hide." Thyra's eyes glistened with unshed tears, a mixture of longing and doubt. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with danger and shadows. Yet in this fragile sanctuary, a spark of something new flickered, a fragile hope born of courage and the quiet promise of dawn. Outside, the storm continued its relentless song, but within the cabin, amid the flickering firelight and whispered breaths, a mother, a warrior, and a child found a moment of peace.
a brief haven in the heart of winter's unforgiving embrace. The bitter news spread swiftly through the settlement, carried by the sharp tongues of neighbors and the restless winds that swept across the frozen fjord. It began as whispers, rumors that twisted and grew with every telling, before settling into a cold, undeniable truth. Thyra Haldorsdottir, the widow whose life had been a quiet struggle against winter's cruelty, had vanished under the cloak of darkness, taken away by a stranger with fiery red hair and the air of a warrior. The absence was a wound felt keenly by the small community. The empty cabin, its door left slightly ajar to the merciless cold, spoke volumes in the silence of the morning. The scent of smoke no longer drifted from the hearth, and the faint trace of the child's hidden warmth was gone. Helga Ingridsdottir paced the hall of the Jarl's longhouse with a cold fury burning behind her steady gaze. The flickering torchlight cast hard shadows across the stone floor, but it failed to soften the sharp tension in the air. Her fingers tightened around the embroidered hem of her dress as she turned to her husband, Jarl Gunnar Thorvaldsson, whose stern face showed the weight of 1,000 battles fought, not with swords, but with secret words and veiled threats. They fled, Helga said plainly, voice low but edged with accusation. Thyra and that red-haired stranger, and the child. They slipped away before dawn, leaving nothing but questions and silence. Gunnar's eyes darkened. The loss was more than personal. It was a threat to the fragile order he had maintained since Ragnar's death. Thyra's son was not merely a child. He was a symbol, a living claim to lands and legacy Gunnar had seized with ruthless precision. The boy's survival undermined every claim he had made to power. He clenched his jaw, the missing fingers of his left hand twitching slightly, as if the memory of old wounds stirred anew. The settlement will not stand for this. The people will demand justice. We must find them before the boy's claim grows into a rebellion. Bjorn Ulfsson, standing silently near the heavy wooden table, nodded. The mischievous glint in his eye had faded into something darker, a sharpened edge of duty and menace. I will gather the men.
We cannot let them slip into the forest or beyond the eastern cliffs unnoticed. Helga's lips curled into a tight smile. Good. Let the hunters track them. Let the tribes beyond know that no one defies the Jar's will without consequence. Outside, the settlement stirred under the weight of the news. Doors closed promptly, whispers faded when strangers approached, and eyes turned suspiciously toward every shadow. The winter air felt heavier, as if the cold itself had thickened with the tension. Among those who heard the rumors was Sigurd, a woman known for her sharp tongue and sharper eyes. She moved through the village like a shadow, her gaze flickering toward the empty cabin with a mixture of curiosity and something darker, envy perhaps, or fear. The widow who dared to hide a secret, she muttered to herself as she passed by the women gathered near the communal fire. The women exchanged knowing glances, their conversations punctuated by whispers of heir and thief. The fragile balance of trust that had allowed Thyra to survive was unraveling thread by thread. But the danger was not confined to the settlement alone. Word traveled swiftly beyond the fjord, carried by traders, hunters, and messengers who braved the winter's bite. Nearby clans, wary of the Jar's growing power, and eyes always sharp for advantage, caught wind of the escape. One such clan, the Raven Folk, was known for their fierce warriors and unyielding loyalty to those who could pay their price. Their chieftain, Hallvard, sat by the fire in his longhouse, listening intently as a scout recounted the tale of a woman and a child fleeing under the cover of night, protected by a red-haired warrior. A boy with a claim to lands that belong to another, the scout finished, voice low. Such news stirs the winds of war. Hallvard's eyes gleamed with a cold fire. We will follow the trail. The jar's enemies become our opportunity. Back in the settlement, the pressure on those left behind mounted. Helga took every opportunity to remind the people of loyalty and order, her voice smooth but cutting. Those who aid traitors risk the same fate. The jar's justice is swift and absolute. Thyra's few remaining allies found themselves under scrutiny. The women who had once shared quiet smiles with her now cast furtive glances, their own fears driving wedges of silence between them. The men who had once pretended not to notice the strange arrivals at her cabin now whispered among themselves, weighing the risks of continued association. Among the crowd, a young hunter named Eric struggled with his conscience. He had seen the stranger with Thyra on occasion, and the tenderness with which they cared for the child was undeniable. Yet the loyalty demanded by the jar weighed heavily on him. To protect Thyra and her son could mark him as a traitor. To betray them could condemn an innocent life.
The days grew shorter and colder, the relentless winter mirroring the growing chill of suspicion and fear. Each creak of a door, each shadow that moved too swiftly, set nerves on edge. The community, once bound by shared survival, fractured under the weight of uncertainty. Meanwhile, on the hidden path beyond the cliffs, Thyra's small group pressed onward. The journey was brutal, deep snow, biting winds, and the ever-present threat of discovery shadowed each step. Eirik, bundled tightly against his mother's chest, whimpered softly, his small body shivering despite the layers of fur. Sigurd moved ahead, eyes sharp and watchful, his sword ever at the ready. His gaze scanned the snow-covered trees, searching for signs that their pursuers were near. The scars on his arms ached with the cold, but his resolve hardened with each passing hour. Soon, he murmured to Thyra during a rare moment of respite, the shore is close, the boat waits. Thyra nodded, though exhaustion weighed heavily on her. Her legs ached, and the chill seeped through even the thickest layers. Yet the fire in her heart burned bright, a fierce determination to shield her son from the fate that awaited should they return. "Do you think they will come for us?" she asked quietly, her voice barely a whisper carried on the wind. Sigurd glanced back, his eyes meeting hers with a steady calm. "They will try, but we will not let them find what they seek." A sudden rustle in the underbrush snapped their attention to the present. Sigurd raised his sword, signaling silence. The group froze as a figure emerged from the shadows. A lone scout, eyes wide with surprise, but quick to retreat when met with Sigurd's fierce gaze. "They are close," Sigurd said grimly. "We must move faster." The days that followed became a relentless race against time and the encroaching darkness. The bond between Thyra and Sigurd deepened, not in words, but in shared glances and unspoken promises of protection. Each night, as Eirik slept fitfully, they huddled around small fires, whispering plans and memories. Thyra's thoughts often drifted to her son's future, a life where he could walk freely, unmarked by fear or secrets. The weight of her secret had been unbearable, but now, with the promise of sanctuary, hope flickered faintly like the dawn on the horizon. Yet, even as they neared safety, the shadow of their pursuers loomed ever closer. The Jarl's men were relentless, their tracks unyielding in the fresh snow. Bjorn led the hunt with a cold precision born of loyalty and the promise of reward. At the settlement, the Jarl's wrath simmered. Gunnar Thorvaldsson's gaze was hard as he confronted those who dared question his authority. "This child is a threat to our order," he declared to the gathered council. "We will not suffer traitors or pretenders. The boy's bloodline ends here." Helga stood beside him, her eyes flicking to the empty chair that had once belonged to Thyra.
"And the mother who shelters him will pay the price." The council murmured assent, their voices heavy with the weight of impending judgment. Back on the path, the wind shifted suddenly, carrying with it the distant sounds of voices, shouts, and the crunch of boots on snow. Sigurd's hand tightened on his sword hilt. "They have found our trail." Thyra's breath hitched, her heart pounding in her chest like a war drum. She drew Eirik closer, shielding him from the cold and the threat beyond. The fragile hope that had carried them this far now faced its greatest test. "Hold fast," Sigurd urged, voice steady but fierce. "We will fight for this child's right to live." The night closed in around them, thick with danger and uncertainty. The chase had become a battle, not just for survival, but for the future of a lineage, a secret kept in shadows, and the fierce, unyielding strength of a mother's love. In the face of gathering storm and relentless pursuit, Thyra's true secret stood not in the hidden child beneath her bed, but in the indomitable will to protect him, come what may. The wind howled through the skeletal trees, whipping the snow into furious spirals that danced like restless spirits beneath the darkened sky. The night pressed down heavily, as if the very air conspired to suffocate the fragile hope that clung to the small band of fugitives. Their breath hung in the cold like ghosts, each exhalation a visible reminder of the life they fought to protect. Thyra tightened her grip on Eirik, the child's shivering body pressed close against her heart beneath layers of furs. His wide blue eyes reflected the flickering light of the small fire Sigurd had managed to kindle, a fragile beacon amid the endless white. The boy's innocence was a fragile shield against the brutal world that pursued them, a world that sought to extinguish the legacy he carried with him, hidden in the depths of his bloodline. Sigurd stood watch, his sword drawn and ready, eyes scanning the shadows beyond the firelight. Every muscle in his body was taut with vigilance, the weight of his promise to Ragnar heavy on his shoulders. The scars that marred his skin itched beneath the biting cold, but his resolve was steel. He would not allow the Jar's men to claim the child, or the woman who bore him. Footsteps shattered the fragile silence, crunching sharply over the frozen ground. A chorus of voices rose in the distance, harsh and unyielding, carrying the unmistakable cadence of the Jar's hunters. Bjorn led them, his cruel smile already etched into the tightening lines of his face, eyes glowing with the cold fire of duty and vengeance. "They have come," Sigurd whispered, low and steady, his gaze never leaving the encroaching darkness. Thyra's heart hammered violently, fear and fury warring within her. She tightened her hold on Eirik, whispering soothing words she barely believed herself. The weight of the secret she had carried for so long threatened to crush her under its unbearable gravity. They were trapped, the shadow of the Jarl closing in like a predator circling its prey. The fire crackled, its golden light trembling as the hunters emerged from the trees like a wave of cold steel and fury.
Bjorn's voice cut through the night, sharp and commanding. "Come out, Thyra Haldor's daughter. The Jarl demands you surrender the boy and stop hiding in the shadows." Thyra stepped forward, her voice clear and unwavering despite the storm raging inside her. "You will find no surrender here, not while I breathe." Bjorn's grin twisted into something crueler. "You defy the Jar, woman. You risk your life and your son's." "Then we shall face that risk," Sigurd answered, stepping beside Thyra, sword glinting in the firelight. "We will not give in to tyranny." The ground between them and the hunters became a tense no-man's land, a frozen battlefield marked by the desperate will to survive. The hunters advanced cautiously, their weapons drawn, faces hard and unreadable beneath the shadows of their hoods. Bjorn's eyes locked on Eric. The boy is a symbol, a claim that threatens the Jarl's rule. Hand him over, and no blood need be spilled this night. Thyra's gaze hardened, fierce and unyielding. "You seek to drown a child's future in your greed and fear. I will not allow it." A low growl escaped from the edge of the campfire, as if the winter itself echoed her defiance. The cold pressed closer, a silent accomplice to the violence lurking in the frozen air. Bjorn sneered and raised his voice. "Then you force our hand." Steel sang as weapons were drawn, the metallic clang ringing through the stillness with brutal clarity. The dance of violence began, a desperate clash beneath the frozen canopy, where every strike could mean life or death. Sigurd moved with practiced grace, the strength of a seasoned warrior flowing through his limbs. His sword was more than a weapon. It was the embodiment of his vow, the shield that defended the hope for a future beyond the Jarl's iron grip. Each parry, each calculated strike was a message. They would fight for this child's right to live. Thyra stood beside him, her own small dagger flashing in the firelight. Though untrained in the art of battle, years of hardship had honed her instincts. She fought with the ferocity of a mother protecting her young, every movement fueled by a love that burned brighter than any winter's chill. The hunters pressed forward, their numbers a tide of cold steel and relentless fury, but Sigurd and Thyra held their ground. The clash of weapons echoed like thunder, the frozen earth beneath them stained with the heat of conflict. Bjorn lunged toward Thyra, a wicked smirk twisting his lips as he swung his axe. She twisted aside, narrowly avoiding the blow, and countered with a quick slash that grazed his arm.
A hiss of pain escaped him, but he pressed on with cruel determination. Sigurd intercepted another hunter, his sword striking with the precision of a man who had long danced the deadly waltz of battle. His eyes blazed with fierce resolve, the promise to Ragnar propelling him forward through the chaos. Eric whimpered softly, the sounds tearing at Thyra's heart. She swept him close, shielding him with her body, a silent vow etched in every breath. No harm would come to this child. The battle raged fiercely, neither side yielding. But beneath the swirling snow and the fury of steel, a silent reckoning took shape. The fight was no longer just for survival. It was a struggle for the soul of a legacy, a future forged in the crucible of sacrifice and unyielding will. Suddenly, a sharp cry pierced the night. Bjorn stumbled, clutching his wounded arm, anger and disbelief flashing in his eyes. The hunters hesitated, their once confident advance faltering as uncertainty crept in. Seizing the moment, Sigurd's voice rang out, commanding and resolute. "Retreat! This fight is not yours to win." Bjorn snarled but nodded, signaling the hunters to pull back. The tide of cold steel receded into the shadows, leaving only the echo of their footsteps and the quiet crackle of the dying fire.
Thyra sank to her knees, exhaustion crashing over her in heavy waves. Eric nestled against her, his small body still trembling, but safe for now. Sigurd sheathed his sword, his gaze never leaving the dark woods where the threat still lurked. "We have bought time," Sigurd said quietly, "but they will come again. The Jarl does not forgive those who defy him." Thyra nodded, her eyes fierce despite the weariness. "Then we must be ready, for them and for what comes after." The night stretched on, silent save for the soft breathing of mother and child and the whisper of wind through the bare branches. The fragile sanctuary they had carved in the midst of winter's wrath was a testament to defiance and hope. But the battle was far from over. The Jarl's shadow loomed larger than ever, a dark cloud threatening to consume all that Thyra fought to protect. Yet, beneath the weight of fear and uncertainty, a quiet strength blossomed, a force born not from steel or blood, but from the unbreakable bond of love and the fierce refusal to surrender. Dawn's first light crept hesitantly over the horizon, washing the world in pale gold and softening the sharp edges of the night. Thyra held Eric close, her heart swelling with a mixture of relief and determination. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with peril and sacrifice, but it was a path she would walk fiercely for the boy who carried the future in his small, fragile hands. Sigurd moved to the edge of the clearing, eyes scanning the distant settlement. "The Jarl's men will not rest. We must find a way beyond their reach." Thyra's gaze met his, steady and resolute. "Then we will fight, not just to survive, but to live."
The fragile threads of their alliance, tested in the crucible of battle, held fast. Together they faced the gathering storm, a mother and a warrior bound by blood and promise. The secret beneath the bed was no longer a prison, but a beacon, lighting the way toward a future shaped by courage, sacrifice, and the unyielding strength of the human spirit. As the sun climbed slowly into the sky, thawing the edges of winter's grip, Thyra allowed herself a moment to breathe, to feel the warmth of possibility stirring beneath the cold. The greatest battle was yet to come, but for the first time in long months, hope stirred like a fierce flame against the frost. And in that light she found a truth more powerful than any secret, that the strength to protect what one loves can turn even the darkest winter into the promise of spring. The dawnlight seeped gently through the tattered curtains of the small cabin nestled deep in the forest's edge. The harsh bite of winter had softened for a brief moment, allowing the sun's pale warmth to touch the world, reluctant but persistent. Inside, the room held a fragile peace, a stark contrast to the storm of fear, violence, and secrets that had ruled the nights before. The air was still, thick with the mingled scents of wood smoke, worn leather, and the faint sweetness of wild herbs that Thyra had gathered during the brief respite. Thyra sat quietly by the fire, her hands cradling the small form of Eric, whose blue eyes fluttered open slowly, taking in the dim glow around him. His breath was steady now, and the tremors that had racked his tiny body the night before had faded into a soft, almost imperceptible shiver. The boy was safe, for the moment. But the weight of what lay ahead pressed heavily on her chest, a familiar ache that no warm fire could soothe. Sigurd sat nearby, his back against the rough wooden wall, eyes alert and distant, as though still scanning the shadows beyond the cabin's fragile walls. The lines etched into his face by years of hardship seemed to soften just slightly in the morning light, a brief reprieve from the hardness that had carried him through countless battles. His hands rested on the hilt of his sword, a silent reminder that their fight was far from over. The quiet between them was thick, filled not with words, but with the unspoken truths that hung between two souls bound by loss, trust, and an uncertain hope. For the first time since their flight, it was clear that their survival depended not only on weapons or cunning, but on something deeper, the fragile, unsteady promise of redemption. Thyra's gaze met Sigurd's, an invitation and a question wrapped in the softness of a woman who had borne too much alone for too long. He shifted slightly, meeting her eyes with the steady calm that had become his shield. "You have done what few could," he said quietly, voice low but steady. "You protected him." She gave a small, weary nod. "I had to. It was never just about survival. It was about love, about keeping alive what no one else seemed willing to see." Sigurd's eyes darkened with understanding. Love makes us fierce and vulnerable. It is both our sword and our shield. For a long moment they sat in silence, the tension easing, the distance between them shrinking with the soft crackle of the fire. The child in her arms stirred again, his small fingers curling tightly around a fold of her cloak. Thyra traced the delicate curve of his cheek, a tenderness that belied the harshness of the world outside. "I feared I would lose him," she whispered, voice barely audible. "To the Jarl's men, to the cold, to everything." Sigurd reached out, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face with a gentleness that surprised them both. "You did not lose him. You gave him a chance, a future." The weight of his words settled between them, a balm to wounds both fresh and old. In that moment, Thyra saw not a stranger, but a man who had carried the burden of a promise made to her lost husband, and now carried forward in silence and steel. Outside, the forest seemed to hold its breath, the wind softening to a murmur, as if acknowledging the fragile peace within. The world beyond the cabin was still dangerous and uncertain, but inside, a tentative thread of hope began to weave itself through the shadows. The door creaked suddenly, and both turned as the muted footsteps approached. A figure stepped into the flickering light. A woman, her face lined with age and care, eyes kind but wary. It was Sigurd, a neighbor from the settlement, who had once eyed Thyra with suspicion, but whose heart had softened in the face of truth. "I heard the fighting," Sigurd said quietly, her voice carrying a mixture of concern and respect. "I came to see if you needed help." Thyra managed a faint smile, the first in long weeks. Help would be welcome. Sigurd nodded, stepping forward carefully, as if entering sacred ground. Her eyes fell upon Eric, and for a moment her own gaze softened, touched by the same fierce love that bound mother and child. "You are brave," Sigurd said, voice low but certain. "Braver than many in the village. They do not understand what you have carried." Thyra's throat tightened. "They fear what they do not understand." Sigurd's expression was grave but resolute. "Fear makes enemies of friends. But I will speak for you. I will tell them what you did, what you still do." The promise hung in the air, a fragile shield against the cold winds of suspicion and cruelty that had shadowed Thyra's life for so long. It was a start, a thread of light that might one day unravel the darkness. As the morning wore on, more footsteps came, quiet, cautious. From the woods emerged Eric, the young hunter who had grappled with his own doubts and fears, but whose conscience had finally won over.
His eyes met Thyra's with a mixture of guilt and determination. "I could not stand by," he said simply.
"You did not deserve the cold shoulders or the whispers. You did what the gods would have us do, protect the innocent." Thyra's eyes glistened with tears she did not try to hide. "Thank you." Eric nodded, his voice steady. "There are others who feel as I do. We will gather them. There is strength in numbers, and even the Jarl must reckon with the will of the people." Sigurd rose, his imposing frame filling the small room with quiet authority. "Then it is time to face what comes next, not as fugitives, but as those who fight for justice." The words stirred something deep within Thyra, a spark of courage that had long been buried beneath fear and pain. For so long she had hidden in the shadows, carrying a secret that could have destroyed her. But now, with allies at her side, and the truth beginning to shine through the cracks, she felt the first breath of something new: redemption. Outside, the sun climbed higher, its weak warmth spilling over the frozen ground. The world was still harsh and unyielding, but within the small circle of firelight and trust, a fragile peace blossomed. Thyra held Eric close, the child who had been her secret and her salvation. She looked to Sigurd and the others gathered, faces weary but resolute, and found in their eyes the reflection of her own fierce will. The road ahead would be fraught with danger, and the Jarl's shadow would not fade easily. But for the first time, Thyra was not alone. She was more than a widow. She was a mother, a protector, a woman who had faced the darkest winter and emerged with a strength that no secret could conceal. And as the wind carried the song of the rising sun through the trees, Thyra felt a quiet certainty settle in her heart. The greatest battles are not won with swords alone, but with the courage to stand, to forgive, and to fight for what truly matters. Together, they would face whatever storms the future held, bound by blood, promise, and the unbreakable strength of love. The sun dipped low behind the distant hills, casting a warm amber glow across the snow-blanketed village. The long winter had finally begun to yield, its icy grip loosening with each passing day. A gentle thaw whispered through the air, softening the frozen earth and coaxing the sap from the hardiest of trees. The settlement, once shadowed by fear and suspicion, now stirred with quiet renewal. Within the longhouse, where smoke curled lazily from the carved stone hearth, the air was thick with the smell of burning pine and simmering stew. The flickering firelight danced upon faces both familiar and new, weaving warmth among a group gathered in uneasy truce, yet tentative hope. The space that had once brimmed with whispered accusations and wary glances now held something different, a shared purpose. Helga, Ingrid's daughter, sat near the fire, her hands folded in her lap, the coldness in her eyes slowly melting into something more guarded, perhaps even a reluctant respect. Beside her, Jarl Gunnar Thorvaldsen's stern features bore the marks of sleepless nights and unspoken reckoning. The power he once wielded with unyielding certainty now felt fragile beneath the weight of change. Across the room, Thyra stood quietly, her green-gray eyes tracing the faces of the villagers she had once feared. Her pale skin, marked with the faint shadows of hardship, seemed to glow softly in the firelight. The mark, shaped like a corvid on her left shoulder, once hidden beneath layers of wool and leather, was now exposed, a silent testament to her strength and survival. The child she cradled in her arms, Eric, rested peacefully against her chest, his blue eyes closed, but his presence a living promise of the future. The journey from hunted fugitive to cautious acceptance had been perilous. Word of their flight and the secret child had sent ripples through the frozen fjord, igniting fear and greed in equal measure.
Yet, through sacrifice and steadfast courage, Thyra and Sigurd had forged a path not only for themselves, but for the settlement itself, a path that challenged old fears and ancient power. Bjorn Ulfson no longer prowled the settlement with his usual cruel grin. His role as the Jarl's enforcer had shifted, and though his loyalty to the old order remained, even he had come to understand the fragile thread upon which peace now hung. The once clear lines of friend and foe blurred in the harsh winter light, as the village grappled with the truth that survival was no longer a matter of domination, but of unity. As the evening deepened, voices rose in quiet conversation. Women who had once whispered behind closed doors now sat beside one another, sharing stories not of suspicion, but of shared endurance. The younger hunters spoke in low tones about the old ways and the new, and the necessity of change in a world that refused to stay frozen. Eric, the young hunter who had once wrestled with his conscience, moved purposefully among the crowd, a subtle smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. He had found a new sense of belonging in the fragile peace, a chance to step beyond fear and embrace the uncertain promise of tomorrow. Outside, the air was crisp but no longer biting. The sounds of children's laughter floated from the open doorways, mingling with the occasional bark of a dog and the distant clatter of tools, signs of life reclaiming its place in the land. The fjord shimmered softly beneath the waning light, a mirror to the sky that now seemed less unforgiving. Amid the gathering, Sigurd Haraldsson stood tall, his red hair catching the firelight as he spoke quietly with Gunnar. The warrior's battle-scarred arms were crossed, but his stance was less defensive now, more hopeful. The promise he had made to Ragnar and kept through countless dangers had not been in vain. The Jarl listened, a hard knot of tension loosening in his jaw. The claim to power he had once guarded with iron resolve had been challenged not by open warfare, but by the unyielding love of a mother and the courage of a few who dared to see beyond fear. Thyra approached slowly, her steps steady despite the weight of the moment. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the quiet strength of one who had faced death and loss and emerged tempered but unbroken. "The boy is not just a symbol," she said softly, her eyes meeting Gunnar's. "He is the future of this land. To protect him is to protect us all from the shadows of old grudges and the chains of fear." A silence followed, heavy and pregnant with meaning. Then, to the surprise of many, Gunnar nodded, a simple gesture, but one that carried the weight of acknowledgement. The path ahead would be difficult, but it was no longer carved by division and suspicion. It was a path shared. Helga rose, her sharp gaze softening as she turned toward the gathered villagers. "Let this be a new beginning," she declared, "where strength is measured not only by sword or kinship, but by the courage to forgive and the will to protect what is just." The murmurs of approval swelled into a chorus of tentative acceptance. The old order was bending, but not breaking. Traditions would shift, as they always did with the passing seasons, shaped by necessity and the wisdom of survival. In the days that followed, life in the settlement took on new rhythms. The children, once confined by whispered fears, now played openly beneath the watchful eyes of parents and elders. The longhouse, once a place of cold politics and whispered threats, became a hearth of community and cooperation. Thyra's cabin, modest yet resilient, grew brighter with the laughter of Eric and the steady presence of Sigurd. The warrior proved not only protector, but teacher, guiding the boy in the ways of their people, instilling in him both strength and patience. Neighbors who had once averted their gaze now stopped to offer quiet smiles and the occasional gift, a hand-woven cloth, a jar of preserved berries, a freshly caught fish. Trust, fragile as new ice on a thawing pond, took root slowly but surely. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, Sigurd stood at the edge of the fjord, gazing out upon the quiet waters. The boat that had carried them from danger lay moored nearby, its sails furled but ready. The journey had changed him, as it had changed Thyra and the boy who now slept peacefully within the village's embrace. A whisper of wind carried the faint scent of pine and salt, a reminder of the vast world beyond their small home. Sigurd's thoughts drifted to the lands to the south, the places Ragnar had once spoken of in dreams and promises. Yet here, in this fragile, reclaimed corner of the north, a new chapter was being written. Thyra joined him silently, her hand finding his. Their fingers intertwined, a touch both simple and profound, a shared bond forged in hardship and hope.
"Do you think we can truly leave the past behind?" she asked, her voice barely above the wind. Sigurd's gaze remained fixed on the fjord's endless horizon. "The past is always with us," he replied, "but it does not have to define us. We carry it like the scars on our skin, reminders of what we've endured. But we choose how it shapes the future." Thyra nodded, her breath mingling with the cold air. "For Eirik, for all of us, I want to believe in that future." A soft smile touched Sigurd's lips. "Then we build it together." As night fell and stars pricked the darkening sky, the village settled into a peaceful quiet. Fires burned low, casting golden pools of light against the snow, and a sense of calm wrapped around the settlement like a gentle cloak. Inside one small cabin, a mother watched her son sleep. Eirik's small chest rose and fell softly, the innocence of childhood, untouched by the burdens that would one day come. Thyra's eyes glistened with tears, tears born not of sorrow, but of profound relief and hope. Her journey had been long and fraught with peril, but in this moment she knew that the greatest secret she had ever guarded was not the child beneath the bed, nor the whispered promises of warriors long gone. It was the strength within herself, the strength to protect, to endure, and to believe in a tomorrow forged not by fear, but by love. Beyond the quiet walls of the settlement, the wind carried the ancient songs of the north, the tales of gods and warriors, of winters survived and springs reborn. Thyra closed her eyes, letting the melody wash over her, a silent prayer to the deities who watched over them all. In the end, she was more than a widow, more than a mother hiding a secret. She was a woman who had faced the harshest winter and emerged with a flame that could never be extinguished, a flame that would light the way for generations to come. And as the dawn crept slowly over the horizon, promising a new day, the world seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what would rise from the ashes of fear and silence. The legacy was hers now to write. The fire's last embers shimmered faintly in the hearth, casting long shadows that stretched like memories across the cabin walls. Outside, the world had settled into a quiet stillness, the soft blanket of snow muffling every sound. The long winter night was slowly giving way to the tentative light of dawn, a fragile promise that whispered of new beginnings. Thyra sat by the window, her gaze distant yet steady, eyes tracing the pale horizon, where sky and earth blurred into a seamless wash of gray and white. In her arms, Eirik slept peacefully, his tiny chest rising and falling softly. The boy was unaware of the battles fought on his behalf, the dangers faced to shield his fragile life from those who would see him lost or broken. Yet his existence was a defiant beacon, a symbol of hope carved in the harshest of winters.
The weight that had pressed upon Thyra's shoulders for so long, the secret she had carried in silence, hidden beneath the bed, cloaked in shadows and whispered rumors, had shifted. It was no longer a burden to suffocate her spirit, but a source of fierce strength, a strength that had propelled her through nights of fear, days of solitude, and the relentless pursuit of those who sought to extinguish the legacy she protected. Sigurd stood at the threshold, watching her quietly. His fiery hair caught the dim light, a stark contrast to the dark world that pressed in from outside. His blue eyes held a depth of experience, scarred yet unwavering, a man shaped by loss and loyalty. He carried the past on his skin and the promise of the future in his steady hands. "You have fought well," he said softly, breaking the silence between them. Thyra met his gaze, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "Not for myself," she replied, "but for him." Her hand tightened around Eric's small fingers. "For our son, for a future where he can walk freely, unafraid." Sigurd nodded, stepping closer. "Ragnar's son carries more than bloodline. He carries the hope of a people. And with you, that hope is alive." Her heart stirred at the weight of his words. But beneath the warmth, a shadow lingered. The knowledge that the path ahead was fraught with uncertainty. The Jarl's reach was long, and the old grudges that clung to the settlement like winter frost would not melt easily. Yet, for the first time, the cold seemed less suffocating. Outside, the wind softened, and the colors of morning seeped gently into the sky. The world was awakening, and with it, so was Thyra's resolve. The secret that once threatened to destroy her had transformed, revealed as a force of resilience, a testament to the unyielding power of love and sacrifice. The cabin door creaked softly, and a figure emerged from the shadows. A neighbor, a woman whose eyes once held suspicion, but now carried understanding. Sigrid stepped inside, carrying with her the fragile promise of alliance and community. Her presence was quiet but profound, a reminder that even in the darkest times, connections could be forged, and fear could be softened by compassion. "We stand with you," said simply. "There are others who see beyond the old stories, who believe in what you protect." Thyra's gaze softened, gratitude stirring like a delicate flame within her chest. The road ahead was still long, the journey uncertain, but for the first time in many moons she felt the stirrings of something powerful, hope. As the dawn stretched its fingers across the frozen landscape, Sigurd moved to the small window, his hand resting lightly on Thyra's shoulder. "This is only the beginning," he said. "The world beyond awaits, and with it new challenges. But here, in this moment, you have found your strength." Thyra looked down at Eric, the boy who had been her secret, her burden, and now her greatest gift. His peaceful slumber was a fragile reprieve from the storms that had battered them, a quiet heartbeat in a world of chaos. "I will fight for this future," she said, her voice a whisper carried on the wind. "Not just for survival, but for life, for love, for the chance to be more than a shadow." Outside, the rising sun touched the snow with a pale light, turning the frozen world into a canvas of possibility. The hardships they had endured, the secrets kept in silence, the battles waged in shadow, all had led here, to a moment of fragile peace and guarded hope. And beneath the weight of winter's long night, a new dawn was breaking. In the end, Thyra understood that the greatest secret she had ever held was not the child hidden beneath her bed, nor the whispered promises of warriors long gone. It was the unbreakable strength within herself, the fierce courage to protect, to endure, and to believe in a future born from love rather than fear. The story of a Viking widow, a hidden heir, and a warrior's promise had become something more. A testament to the resilience of the human spirit, to the power found in the quiet moments between heartbeats, and to the relentless flame of hope that refuses to be extinguished, even in the coldest of winters. As the first light spilled fully over the horizon, Thyra stood, cradling Eric close. The past would always linger like a shadow, but the road ahead was hers to walk, fierce, unyielding, and illuminated by the love that had carried her through the darkest nights. And so, beneath the vast northern sky, where myths are born and legends endure, the greatest secret was revealed, not in whispers or hidden places, but in the strength to rise, to protect, and to live. If this story stirred something within, if the echoes of their journey resonate in your own heart, join us again. There are more tales of the North, more shadows to explore, and more truths to uncover. Because in every frozen night there is a spark waiting to ignite the dawn. Thank you for listening. Your presence keeps these stories alive, carrying the legacy of the Vikings beyond time and into the hearts of those who remember. And remember, sometimes the fiercest battles are fought not with sword or shield, but with the quiet strength to protect what we love, even when the world is shrouded in winter's darkest cold.
If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe. We're just getting started and we really need your support. And may the gods grant you a legendary life.